Hi everyone, now we talk about deregulating transportation in the US economy. To start with, while antitrust law may have been intended to increase competition, much other regulation had the opposite effect. As Americans grew more concerned about inflation in the 1970s, regulations that reduced price competition came under renewed scrutiny. In a number of cases, government decided to ease controls in cases where regulation shielded companies from market pressures. Transportation was the first target of the regulation. Under President Jimmy Carter, Congress enacted a series of laws that removed most of the regulatory shield around aviation, trucking, and railroads. Companies were allowed to compete by utilizing any air, road, or railroad they choose, while more freely setting the rates for their services. In the process of transportation deregulation, Congress eventually abolished two major economic regulations: the 108-year-old Inter-Commerce Commission and the 45-year-old Civil Aeronautic Board. Although the exact impact of the regulation is difficult to assess, it clearly created enormous upheaval in affected industries. They consider airlines. After government controls were lifted, airline companies scrambled to find their way in a new, far less certain environment. New competitors emerged, often employing lower wage, non-nation pilots and workers and offering cheap, not frills service. Large companies which had grown accustomed to government set fares that guaranteed they could cover all their costs found themselves hard pressed to meet the competition. Some, including Pan American World Airways, which to many Americans was synonymous with the era of passenger airline travel. The Eastern Airlines, which carried more passengers per year than any other American airline, failed. United Airlines, the nation's largest single airline, ran into trouble and was rescued when its own workers agreed to buy it. Customers were affected. Many found the emergence of new companies and service options bewildering. Change in fares also were confusing, and not always to the liking of some customers. Monopoles and regulated companies generally set rates to ensure that they meet their overall revenue needs, without worrying much about whether each individual service recovers enough revenue to pay for itself. When airlines were regulated, rates for cross-country and other long-distance routes and for service to large metropolitan areas generally were set considerably higher than the actual cost of flying those routes, while rates for costlier shorter distance routes and for flights to less populated regions were set below the cost of providing the service. With deregulation, such rate schemes fell apart as small competitors realized they could win business by concentrating on the more lactair high volume markets where rates were artificially high. As established airlines cut fares to meet this challenge, they often decided to cut back or even drop service to smaller, less profitable markets. Some of the service later was restored as a new commuter airlines when the divisions of larger carriers sprang up. These smaller airlines may have offered less frequent and less convenient service using propeller planes instead of jets. But for the most part, markets that feared loss of airline service altogether still had at least some service. Most transportation companies initially opposed the regulation, but they later came to accept, if not favor, it. For consumers, the record has been mixed. Many of the low-cost airlines that emerged in the early days of deregulation have disappeared, and a wave of mergers among other airlines may have decreased competition in certain markets. Nevertheless, analysts generally agree that airfares are lower than they would have been had regulation continued. The airline travel is booming. In the 1970s, the airline deregulation began. Passengers flew a total of 226,800 million miles with US airlines. By 1997, that figure had nearly tripled to 605 and 400 million passenger miles. Until the 1980s, in the United States, the term telephone company was synonymous with American telephone and telegraph. AT&T controlled nearly all aspects of the telephone business. Its regional subsidiaries, known as Baby Bells, were regulated monopolies, holding exclusive rights to operate in specific areas. The Federal Communications rights to operate regulated rates on long-distance calls between states, while state regulators had to approve rates for local and in-state long-distance calls. Government was justified on the theory that telephone companies like electric utilities were natural monopolies. Competition, which was assumed to require stringing multiple wires across the countryside, was seen as wasteful and inefficient. The thinking changed beginning around the 1970s as sweeping technological developments promised rapid advances in telecommunications. Independent companies assert that they could indeed compete with AT&T, but they said the telephone monopoly efficiently shut them out by refusing to allow them to interconnect with its massive network. Telecommunications deregulation came into sweeping stages. In 1984, a court officially ended AT&T telephone monopoly, forcing the giant to spin off its regional subsidiaries. AT&T continued to hold a substantial share of long-distance telephone business, but vigorous competitors such as MC Communications and Sprint Communications won some of the business, showing in the process that competition could bring lower prices and improved service. As they said later, pressure grew to break up the Baby Bells monopoly over local telephone service. New technologies, including cable television, self-ruler or wireless service, the internet, and possibly others, offered alternatives to local telephone companies. But economists said the enormous power of regional monopolies inhibited the development of these alternatives. In particular, they said competitors would have no chance of surviving unless they could connect, at least temporarily, to the established companies' networks, something the Baby Bells resisted in numerous ways. So that was about telecommunication in America, economy. Thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe notification button. Also, don't forget to put a like under this video.